Okay, we are back from break. Wanted really quickly to introduce our next keynote address from Eva Velasquez and James Lee from the Identity Theft Resource Center. Let me turn it over to you.
Good morning, everyone, and thank you, Jeremy. Welcome. I'm Eva Velasquez, President and CEO of the Identity Theft Resource Center. For those of you who aren't familiar with us, the ITRC is a nonprofit organization established over 20 years ago to empower and guide victims, consumers, businesses, and government to minimize risk and mitigate the impact of identity crimes and compromise. Today, I'll be sharing the virtual podium with James Lee, the ITRC COO, and we're going to discuss some trends that we've seen at the center. Just last week, we released our annual data breach report. So I'm going to hand this off to James to discuss some of the key findings of that report, and then I'll jump back in with some additional trends. James, take it away.
Good morning, everyone. I trust you can see the slides. The nice big shot of somebody's hands there. We did release our 15th annual data breach report last year. As you may or may not know, we've been collecting data on data breaches since 2005. And when we started back then, we were basically, collecting name, rank, and serial number. All the way to today, where we collect up to 90 data points per breach. Now, not all breaches give us 90 data points, but that's how many we could collect if that data exists or surrounding any given data breach. Some conclusions from this year. First of all, if my slides will cooperate, mass data breaches and the number of individuals impacted are down. And that has been replaced by ransomware and phishing schemes. So fewer expeditions to collect mass amounts of consumer information, more about single attacks that can result in large amounts of things that you can monetize. That is out. This mass collection is out, but more targeted attacks are in particular attacks that can yield logins and passwords. Credentials are the coin of the realm today, as opposed to what we have traditionally thought of as being the kind of information that threat actors wanted to collect. And then lastly, and this is the point that Eva will focus in on, is while we're seeing this trend of a downward collection of mass amounts of data, we are seeing an increase in identity fraud. And along with that, we're seeing a decrease, though, in the resources available to support the victims of these kinds of crimes and compromises. So let's look specifically at what does this year's data breach report tell us. So as you can see here, when you break data breaches into its constituent parts, data breach is sort of a generic term. At the ITRC, we view these things a little bit differently than some of the other reports you may see. First of all, we make a distinction between a breach and an exposure. So a breach is where your system is actually corrupted and data is exfiltrated. So it is removed or stolen from that place where it was created and was at rest. So that in our definition is a breach. You contrast that though with an exposure, so a compromise. And that is where most commonly somebody forgets to put the password on the cloud environment. So that data never leaves the environment where it was created or stored. So it's available for viewing. It is still data at risk, but it's not the same risk as data which has been exfiltrated, where it's been removed from that place where it was created. So as you can see here, the longer term trend, so going back to 2017, has been this downward. It's a little lumpy, but it is overall, it's been a downward trend in mass collection of consumer information. Just from 2019 to 2020, that's about a 19% drop year over year. It's a 33% drop over the life of from our high in 2017 to the end of 2020. 33% drop in terms of overall. You can also see the number of exposures has also declined, along with the number of raw number of breaches. In terms of raw number of true data breaches and overall, we're basically back to where we were in 2016. So let's look at this a different way. And that is, let's look at this contrast between impacted individuals as well as the breach, and break it into its constituent parts once again. So if you look at it from an individual impact, not a records stolen. So a lot of the breaches reports you'll see elsewhere talk about number of records that were breached. We actually calculate the number of individuals impacted. So here you will see that from a data breach perspective, there are fewer people being impacted than the data compromises. So those cloud environments that are being exposed actually expose more individuals to risk. It's a relatively low risk, but it is not zero risk, versus the people who are at a higher risk because of a true data breach. So there's about a 10 million, 11 million swing there in terms of the number of individuals impacted. When you look at the number of people impacted, the drop is even more dramatic than the drop in data breaches. So if you're looking at a year over year, that's a 66% drop. That's a significant, and that's a very healthy drop. That's very good news in a lot of ways. If you look at it compared to our all-time high back to 2016, where we hit the all-time high in terms of individuals impacted, that's an 88% drop over time. So we should look at that as an indication that we are doing some good things to help slow and reduce the impact. But it does not mean that we have to relax, and it does not mean we can congratulate ourselves, because the main issue that is driving this is the fact that the bad guys have changed tactics. Let's look at the root causes of these compromises now. So we break them into three parts: cyber attacks, human and system errors, and physical attacks. We'll start with cyber attacks because that is the largest constituent part. So we tracked 878 events last year, which qualified as a cyber attack. But when you look at, again, the constituent parts within that, phishing, smishing, business email compromise, by all accounts, the largest part of that component, followed right behind that with ransomware. Those are also hard to separate in large respect, because most of those ransomware numbers, if you dig into those, are going to be related in some way to a phishing attack, by and large. Still a significant number because of an actual breach of a system, particularly because of unpatched software. But those two elements right there make up the majority of the root causes of cyber attacks. Both of those kinds of attacks do not require the level of mass information that we've seen collected historically. They all rely primarily on what? Logins and passwords. So we're going to talk about that more in just a second. System and human errors is the second component of the breach numbers, 152 events. So you can see there's a big drop off from the cyber attacks, which are the vast majority of events. So I'll digress for a second. If we were having this conversation in 2006, after our first breach report from 2005, you would find that we were talking more about physical kind of attacks. We're talking about paper kind of issues, not the cyber attacks that we're seeing today. In this human and system error element, the number one far and away is people just forgetting to configure their cloud environments. It's nothing more complicated than that. Now, we break out over into cyber attacks if there was an actual exfiltration of data from this failure to secure. If data was exfiltrated, that's a cyber attack. If the data is not exfiltrated, it's here, it's a human error. Somebody didn't do their job. And we can debate all day long why that is, but the reality is there are a significant number of companies who still do not operate under the theory that they are responsible for the security of whatever goes into the cloud. They think it's Amazon's, they think it's Microsoft, they think it's Oracle's, they think it's somebody's problem other than theirs, because they were sold into this concept of a cloud environment as being a way to reduce their cost and effort. You are still responsible for everything you're responsible for on-prem when you move to the cloud. So if you pick up your stuff and you move it into the cloud, all of your security has to go with it. And in large respects, you have to have new kinds of security because of just the nature of the structure. So what we see here is organizations still operating as if they're not responsible fully for cloud environment security. We still see a lot of emails and in some cases actual letter correspondence through the post that includes personally identifiable information. So we do still see people just emailing files with reams of personal information in it. But not very often, but it does happen. It happens more often than what you see over here in the last category, which is physical attacks, which is about half of what you're seeing in the human and system errors. Device theft, clearly, I don't think it'd be a surprise to anyone. That's primarily, handheld devices, phones, tablets. I would still see some laptops, but not to the degree that we saw, 5-10 years ago. And then document theft. People do still steal documents, or we did have a case this year. In fact, most of the impact in that category was from a single incident in the Chicago area where a document management company went out of business. And when they were cleaning up the storage that company had previously, they discovered storage rooms filled with boxes of primarily personal health information, which supposedly had been destroyed years ago, was still sitting in boxes in a storage room in Chicago. So in that case, that was where there was paper documentation that existed with just vast quantities of personal information. One note here, it's not on the slide, but I want to point it out, and that is we have almost seen the final throes of skimming devices, physical skimming devices. There are only 5 skimming attacks reported as the root cause of a data breach in 2020. And I think we probably all know why that is. That is largely because of the changes in the point of sale systems. The last vestiges of a chip and pin free POS system is still pay at the pump. That was supposed to happen last year. Now it's been pushed into this year. So once that happens, we fully accept to see device-based skimming to basically go away. We may still have digital skimming, either embedded in websites or in Bluetooth devices, but the good old-fashioned replacing a skimmer on a point of sale system, it will be dead and gone. Here's an interesting slide, because when you take all of what I've just told you and you roll it into what does this mean for individuals and what does it mean for the kind of data that the threat actors are looking for, this chart tells you. The relative value of what we have built processes and infrastructure to protect does not match. We've built processes to protect things like account numbers and social security numbers and other things, and we still have to protect those. But because we have become very good at protecting those, the bad guys are looking for other kinds of data that they can use to monetize their attacks. And this is where you begin to see that logins and credentials on the dark web marketplaces and those identity marketplaces are valued far higher than what we have traditionally thought. So if you look at the data that is being compromised in both exposures as well as true breaches, yes, you're still going to see a high number of social security numbers, but those are used now as verification, not as the point of entry. You're going to see some credit card data, but it's not going to give the bad guys the mass kinds of cash that they're looking for. So you can see here on the slide, a price list from one of the major marketplaces. Your basic MasterCard or Amex are going to get you, $15 to $35, right? But if you drop down to your Gmail account, which, as we all know, people use the same login and password on multiple accounts, both at work and at home. So if you can get that Gmail account, you may have the keys to the kingdom to be able to execute a very devastating kind of ransomware attack. That Gmail account's worth $155. My credit card, $15. My Gmail account, $155. My social security number for an adult, $4. Not exactly the most valuable piece of information anymore. The single highest priced item that you're seeing now on the dark web are two things. One, if you can steal a Fortnite gamer skin, you can get up to $25,000 for a top tier player. Has no impact on anything other than you have bypassed everybody else trying to get to the top of the heap, and you didn't have to play all those weeks or however long it takes you to get to that level. So you can become an elite player if you've got $25,000 in your pocket. More practical for our purposes, though, is the value of an email administrator's login. $120,000 to start. So this shows us the real world impact of what the bad guys are doing. They are no longer interested in attacking 100 or 1,000 consumers at $300 a pop, when they can go to an organization through a ransomware attack or through a business email compromise attack, and get hundreds of thousands of dollars, if not millions of dollars, in a single attack. I want to talk specifically about supply chain for just a second. And that's because we did have some anomaly last year, and it illustrates the point I just made. Why would you attack 500 companies when you can attack one company and get the data of 500 companies? And that's exactly what happened with the supply chain attack against Blackbaud. We also have seen the supply chain attack linked to SolarWinds. And now, as we're seeing, that there were other organizations hit that had no connection to SolarWinds, but a similar kind of attack through a supply chain. Blackbaud, for purposes of our discussion, though, was only a single attack. Yet more than 500 organizations have said our data was at risk because of that ransomware attack. And those 500 organizations represent more than 12 million individual people. So if we were to look at the data a little bit differently, and you treat each of those as separate attacks, the numbers we've just talked about would be higher. However, it was a single attack. It was only a single effort by the threat actors, which yielded them a significant amount of money for a relatively low amount of effort, which is exactly what they are trying to do. And now that's our data. Eva is going to pick it up from here and talk about some of the other practical effects of the things that we've just talked about.
Thank you, James. That was fantastic. And yes, now I'm going to touch on some other noteworthy trends that we saw last year. Look, I know this is an understatement to say 2020 was a unique year, but particularly when it comes to pandemic-related fraud, it truly was. In addition to all the threats that we were previously dealing with, some of which James just highlighted, we saw other vulnerabilities in our systems and new exploitation types emerge. And the introduction of the economic relief packages, while necessary, created new opportunities, and they were more lucrative. And so it really made the bad actors come out to exploit them. And they were especially prevalent in our distribution processes. These bad actors absconded with those dollars, leaving those legitimately in need with little to no recourse. And this was a problem at both the federal and the state level. This bottom chart shows the contacts that the Identity Theft Resource Center received regarding stimulus payments. So a brand new fraud type for 2020. And you can see that spike in contacts in May, and then it tapered off as 2020 came to a close. However, with the new round, this is now an ongoing problem. We saw another spike last month in January of 2021, and it's currently continuing. We had a similar experience at the state level, and this was with unemployment benefits, identity theft, or unemployment fraud. And for context, this is not a new problem. The use of someone else's credentials to obtain government benefits or services like unemployment, it's been around for a long time. We, the ITRC, average about 10,000 cases and contacts annually every year. Last year, it was around 11,000. And that's for all identity fraud types. In 2019, we had a total of 19 contacts into our call center for this particular issue. Total of 19 for unemployment's identity theft in 2019. In 2020, that number spiked to more than 900. And it keeps going. These are just the 2020 numbers. Last month, we had an additional 145 contacts regarding this problem. And no state was immune. This occurred across all 50 states. And to date, it has cost us billions. Some recent numbers out of the state of California are reporting fraud numbers at about 11 billion. And of course, that's just what's been detected. That's just what we know about. Those numbers are going to increase. And, stepping away from the data for just 1 second, our frontline advisors who were handling these calls were reporting to me daily that people were contacting us, crying, sobbing, really, because after they finally got through, after weeks of trying to file their claim, their claim was denied. And they were denied because they were told they were already receiving those benefits. That in turn made them have to start all over again, report the fraud, wait for resolution, and then wait to receive those essential dollars to meet their basic needs. And most of these people were reaching out to us because they couldn't get in touch with anyone at the appropriate agency to report or resolve the problem. They were truly stuck, not knowing what to do. And it was really heartbreaking for everyone on our team. That is a huge problem in and of itself. The agencies simply did not have the resources or capacity to respond to the problem and meet those needs. Now, again, we've talked about a lot of data. So James, next slide, please. And I'm not going to dispute that it plays an important role of our understanding and the landscape, but it's not the entire story. It doesn't give us the full picture. Are we playing musical slides?
It's, technology,
has a mind of its own.
This is a technology group, right? So of course it's going to misbehave. Yeah.
So, okay, now this is where I would like to really do more to humanize some of this data. It's really easy for us to forget when we analyze all of these numbers that, behind every one of them, there is an actual person that is being represented, whose life is being adversely impacted. And I believe that building and sharing a better understanding of these impacts is really one of the critical roles that the Identity Theft Resource Center has. It's a huge part of our mission. And one of the ways that we accomplish this goal is through our aftermath study. We survey all of the victims that we've assisted in a previous year, and we ask them about their experience. Not just how much time did you spend and how much money did you lose, but we go much deeper than that. What were the emotional, the physical, the behavioral consequences? How was your life impacted? What were the lost opportunity costs? And when I say lost opportunity costs, consider the job applicant who doesn't pass the background check due to fraud, or the college-bound student who's unable to obtain necessary loans because a thief has destroyed their credit, unbeknownst to them, and they have to delay pursuing higher education until they remediate that case. How do we measure the cost of those lost opportunities? So we ask all of those questions in our aftermath survey, and I'd like to highlight some of the trend data here from our most recent survey. We're seeing increases in feelings of helplessness and powerlessness, increases in feeling violated. We're seeing increases in housing and financial insecurity. And two of the things that really stood out to us are the increases in re-victimization rates and suicidal feelings. 28% of those surveyed reported that they were a previous victim of an identity crime versus 21% in our previous aftermath study. And the increase in suicidal feelings hit double digits for the first time since we've been doing this study. And while we generally will have a small number of respondents, 3%, 6%, reporting that they were feeling suicidal, which is absolutely tragic, this year it was 10%. Let that sink in. It was 10% of victims felt so overwhelmed and despondent that they considered ending their own life as an option. Now, we'll be releasing this full study in May, and I'm going to encourage everyone who's listening to add it to your required reading. It really helps us not only to identify the trends and do a deep dive into the data, but it reminds us of the people behind all of this data. Next slide, please. Well, with all of those increases that we've been talking about, there is one thing right now that isn't increasing, and that's funding for victim services. So this is happening at the same time while all of those incidents are skyrocketing. If you take a look at the chart, the FTC chart reporting fraud rates, that blue line is you can see the increases in all fraud types. The orange line is just identity theft. So while we're looking at these numbers of increases across all fraud types and identity theft, the number of funds available for crime victim support and service programs has been trending downward over the last few years. In 2019, there was approximately 2.7 billion made available, and last year that number dropped to 1.8 billion. Now, the vast majority of those funds are in the form of block grants. They go to the states to administer their programs. Within that, there's a small amount, the amount of discretionary funds. Now, these are the type of funds that ITRC and other NGOs use to fund their programs, and they've also significantly decreased. In 2019, it was 311 million. In 2020, it was less than half that amount, 144 million. And for those of you who aren't familiar with the VOCA, the Victims of Crime Act, and the fund that I'm talking about, these aren't taxpayer dollars. This is a fund that is replenished by criminal fines, forfeited bail bonds, penalties, and special assessments. And deposits into this fund have decreased in recent years due to a decline in fines and penalties recouped from federal criminal cases. And we're not the only ones talking about this issue. Recently, 56 AGs signed a letter urging Congress to adopt changes that would ensure predictability and sustainability of these funds. And while their main focus has been on government-run programs for victims, and particularly victims of violent crimes, we can't forget about those discretionary funds that many charities rely on to serve their victim populations, in particular, nonviolent crime victims, economic crime victims, fraud victims, identity theft victims. I think it's time that we stop kidding ourselves that being a victim of identity theft or fraud or cybercrime is not a life-altering event. We know that it is. The victims are telling us that it is. The findings of the aftermath report are telling us that it is. Let's consider the long-term consequences of this trend, just in our space, just in the identity crime and compromise space. If we no longer have choices, support for victim support programs for nonviolent crime victims, we limit their recovery options. Victims will have only paid service providers to turn to in their time of need. And we know from the numbers we saw with the unemployment identity theft, with the stimulus identity theft, that the thieves are not just targeting high net worth individuals. Many of these folks don't have the disposable income to hire a company, pay a service, hire an attorney to assist them in reclaiming their identity. This is not the direction that we want to be heading in. We need more options and more resources for these victims, not less. Thank you, everyone, for this opportunity.
It's a wonderful panel. Everyone, thank you for being here. I think to set the tone, I'd love to hear from Ben, telling us, what you're seeing on the ground. You are really in the trenches, and please share some of those experiences with the audience and the folks that are listening about what you're seeing at ID Ministry and the help you're providing and some of those barriers. When you mentioned that you help provide, pay the fees for the costs of these identity documents, it's so easy for us to forget that $10, $15, $20 to replace an identity document can be the difference between someone obtaining it and obtaining it.
Yeah, absolutely. And where I am, it's all kind of user experience, I suppose, with the systems and the policies that are getting created and built. And what we had typically seen prior to pandemic, you're looking at an average cost for somebody around $68 if we're talking about a birth certificate and an ID in DC. That doesn't include things like transportation to go from place to place. If you have to find childcare, if you have to take off time from work, it's just kind of $68 for the documents that you have to pay for. And that's in ideal circumstances, presuming that you only need to get a social security card, which is free, get your birth certificate, and then get your ID credential. That would usually take around a month at best if somebody came to see me and had no documents on hand to start with. That would be fast. I've had it take upwards of 3 years for an individual to complete the process from zero to a valid ID. Now that we're kind of into our pandemic mode, time and cost have both increased. We are still not with in-person service at the Vital Records office in DC. Everything is online now through VitalCheck. And because of that, we saw a 65% increase per birth certificate, going from 23 with an added on $15.99 to each piece. And when you're talking about folks who are earning $17,000 a year or less, that's a huge cost and quickly becomes a barrier. And that's while they're trying to do things like get a job or get into housing to get stable. We work typically with people who have lost documents from anything from like a house fire, which is very easily to be sympathetic toward, to evictions, which we're kind of on the precipice if we don't continue to delay with policy, all the way to kind of the more heartbreaking things that I see in terms of someone who sleeps on the street and then the city comes by and clears all of their belongings and they lose their document in that way. So these are the types of situations that we tend to see each week. And they're not really typical for what I imagine like the regular user experience that is in mind when we're kind of developing the software systems to help with like the knowledge-based assessments or to help in terms of like just the amount of processing that has to happen. I don't think that these stories are really upfront as we're building those systems and these policies. Just in the last 10 days, and one that I think fits really well today, as we've talked about the unbanked and folks who are just kind of at risk from being on their own. We're working currently with a young lady, did not know her parents growing up, lived with her aunt until her senior year of high school when her aunt died. And because of that death, she became homeless. Luckily, she got into college, so she's currently housed through the college. However, she is not banked. She does not have her ID. She can't open a banking account. And that's what kind of spurred her to come and see us. But in this process, we learned that what we're calling a typo is on the birth certificate, where her first name is spelled ending with an N instead of how she has spelled it her entire life, ending with an A. And that one letter has prevented her from being able to get the breeder document, which is the birth certificate. And that then prevents her from successfully completing the process for the Social Security card, because of course the documents aren't matching in that instance. She can't produce proof of Social Security through her W-2 because the full number is not on there, even though she is employed and getting paid. And with all of this, getting back to that unbanked portion, she can't cash the full value of her check. She has to go to a check cashing operation that takes a percentage, and that includes not only her regular work checks, but also the stimulus checks that she received, which would have been a huge boon for her as she's on her own. But that puts her not only in a situation where she loses a portion of her income, but it also puts her in an unsafe situation, she feels, where she has to carry large amounts of cash around, and that doesn't feel safe at all for her. And so as we're going through this process, the standard procedure just isn't available for her. And we have to go through the extra hoops of having a caseworker apply on her behalf, which takes extra time, submit by mail. And even with you may have heard of some like delays in the mail systems right now. Those are real, and it impacts the way that people can kind of move on with their life. With her, it's just opening a bank account. With so many of my folks, it's delays for getting a job or getting into housing, where you are perhaps getting sober for the first time, but the delay for housing took so long, you had a relapse. And I'm dealing with that right now with some of my neighbors. All of this comes down to cost and money. We can handle the cost. We can't really do anything about how long it takes for individuals to get some of these things done. And so we're always interested in these spaces to know that people are thinking beyond the typical user experience to things that may seem like kind of one-off or an oddity or an abnormality and what people experience. But for me, we experience these things every single week, and we're helping close to 2,000 people a year. They're not an oddity for us. They're real and they're frequent. And so we're always interested in knowing that the policymakers and system builders are paying attention to those experiences as well.
So 2,000 one-offs in 1 year in one small region.
Yes.
Such a good reminder that we have to have our systems take these things into consideration. And, you know, that's really that lack of access conversation, but there's another piece to this, and that's the lack of control. There are folks, particularly in the human trafficking space, where they may know and they may have some level of access to their foundational identity documents and their identity credentials. They don't have control over them. Someone is using them, and maybe they're doing it through coercion, maybe it's through threat of violence, but this is another group and another population that we have to really keep our eyes focused on and realize that we have to implement systems and processes that help address that. And I'd like to turn it now to Teresa. If you could share some of the insights and key findings from the report to Congress, that analysis of anti-money laundering efforts related to human trafficking, I think that we can get some good insight from some of that other aspect.
Sure, thank you. And just to kind of reiterate what was said earlier, you know, we're looking at these illicit finance threats and systemic initiatives to enhance integrity and transparency of our international financial system. And that includes human rights and corruption. And so the way we look at human trafficking, for example, is through that lens of how it intersects with corruption and how it is, you know, a human rights abuse when someone is being trafficked or subject to slavery and forced labor. So we really take a kind of whole approach, and how can we use all of our tools and authorities to combat human trafficking, not only about going after the bad guys and those that are perpetrating and profiting from human trafficking, but how can we use our financial tools to really help those that are impacted by human rights abuse, survivors of human trafficking. And that's the work that I do with Anne is critically important. And I really rely on her as the subject matter expert on digital ID. You know, when I first started on this, I was like, I know digital ID is a great tool, but how can we really use it, and really just going with her and her expertise. Okay, how can we mesh what you're doing in the broader context of bringing digital ID, and how can we integrate that in what we're trying to do in a human rights context in combating human trafficking? So it's so critically important. It's so critically important that we break down these kind of silos and barriers, not only within our own institutions, but having those partnerships. And so that was one of the key findings within our report, which I'll get to in a second. And I believe others before me have also spoken about how important partnerships are. Partnerships between civil society and the private sector, fintech, partnerships with financial institutions, and partnerships with government, and our partnerships with other governments to be able to make this a reality for all those across the world. It's so critically important. And as you mentioned, particularly survivors of human trafficking or those that are affected through migration or refugee and asylum issues, they can lack those foundational documents. And so it's critically important not only for them to be able to access the banking system, but also to be able to access all of these other types of potential benefits that they may be able to receive. So Treasury has been really leading these efforts, and specifically Anne, to support this risk-based approach to adopt responsible digital solutions for survivors of human trafficking and others to help obtain access to the financial system. So when we were tasked by Congress to produce a report in consultation with the financial institutions, NGOs, and survivors on human trafficking on what are our money laundering efforts as a government as well as private sector efforts on combating money laundering associated with human trafficking, that was something we really wanted to ensure that was in there and in this report, because we see it's so critically important. It's great to have strong AML controls. We need to have that, but then we also need to be able to use our tools to help support victims. So I'll highlight kind of what we put together with working with private sector, NGOs, and survivors to really help improve our efforts in this area. So we have stated, that Congress should consider passing legislation to allocate grant dollars to be able to assist victims, help them obtain credentials or identity verification services to help them get either a driver's license or a state ID card, because this would really help survivors of human trafficking be able to obtain those ID documents. I mean, in many cases, their bank accounts can be taken over by their trafficker. And so not only do they lack foundational documents in some cases, they also lack access to be able to get their own bank account. So it's so critically important. So what we're doing is really looking at remedies for human trafficking survivors and barriers for them in obtaining legitimate banking services, and other barriers as well when it comes to fraudulent activity and purchases in their name when it's misused by traffickers. And one thing, I was recently a part of a panel right before this one, and we were speaking of some international solutions, and one of the countries was talking about how they are implementing a digital ID program to help those that are getting relief from the pandemic, those from low-income areas in particular that have been marginalized, and using digital ID to help them access to be able to get and use that money that they're getting from the government to be able to buy groceries and essential items like that. So there's so much work on this, and I'm going to just particularly focus kind of on the human trafficking aspect of it. But it really does apply so much more broadly to so many different individuals that need it. And so back on partnerships, one thing that we did 2 years ago was hosting at Treasury our Partnership to Combat Human Rights Abuse and Corruption event, where we're bringing together the NGOs, industry, and other government partners on information sharing and coordination on the illicit finance and corruption networks that are associated. This past year, however, we kind of took a different approach to really talk about, using financial tools to help survivors. So Anne actually led a panel with myself and others on information sharing models and ways that different partners across the globe are using digital identity to help survivors of human trafficking. And so our panel really focused on these different types of solutions. And a lot of the details I'm going to leave to Anne because she is the expert on this, and I really rely on her to help with that. But really to help support financial inclusion and victim services for those persons or refugees and human trafficking, those survivors of natural disasters and other individuals that are facing major disruptions. So we really wanted to help prevent the exploitation and displacement in the first place. And so we looked at how innovation and technology can be a power center for good. And so we had the UN High Commissioner for Refugees speaking, as well as Microsoft's Digital Identity Group and the head of the Secretariat for what's called the FAST Initiative, the Finance Against Slavery and Trafficking. And so they really talked about, and I just want to highlight some of these kind of public-private partnerships that are out there to be able to get digital ID services to help these individuals. So the UNHCR was really looking at displaced persons and other people in humanitarian crisis to help them get immediate assistance and then access to some long-term financial inclusion issues such as access to housing, healthcare, employment, and education. So they were providing and teaming up with the private sector on deploying digital identities for displaced persons and refugees. One of those partners was Microsoft, and they spoke about their digital identity innovation space and how they're partnering on identity proofing and authentication in this area. And their solution obviously applies pretty broadly to all kinds of different services, but it was really interesting to hear how it's being particularly used in this case to help get access and to help those who are impacted. Really brought it down to a practical application of these different types of innovation and technology tools. So they were looking at in-person customer identification, verifying onboarding, and other pilots that they're doing across the world. And then lastly, the FAST initiative was looking at digital identity solutions and services to reduce vulnerabilities for forced labor and forced migration in both developing and developed countries. So they've been really encouraging the use of alternative underwriting for microfinance loans and microinsurance digital financial planning tools and digital identity solutions that can get access to facilitate access to financial services. So this is on reducing vulnerabilities, but also on the response side, they identified how personal identity information and identity evidence can be used to conduct illicit financial activities as a common occurrence for types of different abuse and exploitation. And so they're really kind of looking at this and working with financial institutions and governments across the world, not only on digital ID, but so many other things. So I have those resources and I can add them to the chat. And thanks, Jeremy, for adding the report into the chat, where we really tried to make that note to Congress, where this was something that we heard from the private sector, from survivors of human trafficking and NGOs that are serving victims of human trafficking, that they really needed to see these digital identity solutions deployed within state governments as well. So I'll turn it over back to you, and I'm happy to answer questions later. Thank you so much for having me.
So we've got about 10 more minutes, and I would love to, let's take all of these insights and all of this information and go around and talk about, where do we go from here? How do we move forward? How do we take this, and what are some practical thoughts you have for either a next step or, I'd love to say if you had a magic wand and you could wave it, what would be the one thing that you would do and make happen? So we can spend a couple of minutes talking about what that would be. Ben, let's go ahead and start with you.
Yeah, thanks. Certainly, I think it kind of boils down for us, and what we experience is some of this this cost and its time. And it's got to cost less for folks who are really vulnerable. It's got to take less time for people who are in need of the credential in order to proceed with their normal life. Those things are both real. And then just continually recognizing, I don't think anybody's delusional about this, but like the systems that we have in place are imperfect. A lot of times, some of the knowledge-based assessments that we encounter, they are drawing on information that, for like a younger guest of mine, they're drawing on information of their parents. And if there's a severed relationship there, which we've had come up a number of times, they're asking the kid questions about a parent they never knew who owned property in Florida, and the child is sitting there trying to verify their identity. They're like, I've never lived in Florida in my life. And so they fail the KBA, and they're further delayed in that. And so just continually having the policymakers and the system builders consider these kind of extraordinary events as it compares to the average user, and just remember that they're not really that extraordinary. They are happening time and again from where I'm sitting, and I'm seeing more organizations kind of popping up around the country right now, kind of focused on it from the voter ID perspective, but they're running into the same problems that we've been running into for close to 2 decades now. They're motivated because they want people to vote. I'm still motivated because I want people housed and employed and serviced in the proper way. And I would love for people to also be able to vote. It comes down to what state are you in. So I'm like, let's really be mindful going forward, as this thing has kind of hit light speed because of the pandemic and us needing to be more online. Let's really be mindful as we continue these developments, that there are user experiences out there that are not necessarily included currently in the development.
Thanks, Ben. And Anne, let's go to you. What would you do with that magic wand?
Well, having listened to Ben, I'd like to kind of revise what I had in mind, which is one thing. I think one really needs to be responsive to the needs that he was talking about. And so one of my magic wands would be that people take advantage of the risk-based approach when you're dealing with regulatory requirements for digital identity, which does allow various different kinds of identity attributes and different levels of assurance depending upon the risk. And the FATF guidance goes into considerable detail about how a risk-based approach to digital identity can support financial inclusion and kind of opening accounts and access where risk can be mitigated in other ways, for example, with low value beginner accounts, that sort of thing. And so I think that both leveraging the technical standards and trust framework of NIST and an understanding that there is flexibility because our BSA and AML framework here in this country, as well as the global standards established by FATF, do emphasize a risk-based approach for customer due diligence, including customer identification and verification. So I just was very moved by Ben's kinds of experience. But the other thing is that my bigger wish, or separate wish, because of course I'm greedy, so I want the genie in the lamp to give me two and not just one, but it would be that all relevant stakeholders, including Congress and the American public, would really understand that trustworthy digital identity is a critical element of this country's financial sector infrastructure, and that it's essential for our recovery from the COVID crisis, as well as equitable access and opportunities in all different sectors, whether it's financial, educational, healthcare, and with that understanding, treat the development and implementation of responsible, privacy-preserving digital identity ecosystem, with both the private sector and government playing our appropriate roles, as a matter of national security and economic recovery and competitiveness priority. And that would include adequate funding. That's my big wish.
I love those. I say hear, hear. And to Ben, I understand completely what you're saying. We can't build systems and build things based on the exception, but we can have universal processes that people can use when they find themselves being the exception. And I'd like to, that would be my magic wand. I'd like to see more attention paid to building those remediation and recovery processes in a very universal manner, so that, you know, everyone has access to them and anyone can use them for themselves. So with that, let's go to Teresa, and then, you know, Sean, we'll let you wrap up.
Wow. Well, after Anne, I mean, as I said, and you hear, she's really the expert on this, and I yield my wish to Anne since she had two, because that's just incredible. And that's exactly why, like, she was selected by the Financial Action Task Force to help craft the guidance on digital ID. Like, she knows this stuff and she knows how it applies in this area. So I yield my wish to Anne, and I don't know if Anne wants
I get another one.
but I mean, she just said it so well, and that would absolutely be my wish. Particularly this one, I think it's just so important to be able to use these types of services and to be able to encourage not only Congress but American people how this is.
That's awesome. I tell you what, Anne, let's go to Sean, and if we have time, then you can have a third. We'll let you.
That one might get me in trouble. Maybe we should forget that one.
All right, so Anne, my wish requires your two wishes to come true. So in a sentence, proactive, real-time detection, prevention, and prosecution of human crime, which is underpinned by a true cross-industry data sharing. That would be my wish. The bad guys in the world operate in real time and in an agile and nimble way, and we have to do the same if we're going to ultimately win.
Well, and that requires involvement. It requires all of us to step out of our, our sort of defined roles and get involved. And I know I saw Jeremy sharing in the QA that folks can get involved with Ben's organization, with the ID ministry. Folks can get involved with the Noble. Their mission is amazing, and they're highly collaborative. And of course, at the risk of sounding very self-serving, you can get involved with the Identity Theft Resource Center. Anne and Teresa, I don't know how folks can help the Treasury Department and how they can get involved, but I suspect you could probably find a way. We do have 2 more minutes. We can open it up to just sort of closing thoughts from everyone, unless you guys want to yield and let Anne have her third wish.
Oh, no.
So closing thoughts, any final remarks as we wrap it up?
I mean, I'll just jump back and say, you know, as these things continue to come online, I'm re-experiencing like 2013, 2014, when the standards for Real ID came into place, and we went from a space of seeing clients succeed at around 79% of the time overnight to only succeeding at a rate of around 39% of the time. That's huge for people. So as we're bringing as we're rolling things out, as we're bringing things online, as new policy is put in, as new systems come into play, really do your level best to ensure that people are not getting left behind, or to build in, Eva, as you said, kind of those kind of remedial steps, as it were, for recovery and things like that. Go ahead and put them in place now so that I'm not having to come fight you later. That would be really great.
Well, I think we're at time. Jeremy, I think you're going to pop back on. This was a wonderful panel.